He read it for 9 minutes. Then he closed the folder, stood up, fastened his jacket, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. And in doing so, Mark Carney may have just executed the most powerful negotiating move in the history of North American diplomacy. This was not a walkout in protest. This was not a dramatic gesture for the cameras. This was the calculated, deliberate exit of a man who had spent 18 months building the very thing that made leaving possible, and who knew the moment he opened that folder that the United States had not yet understood what Canada had quietly become. Before we get into what was inside that folder, drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Do you think Carney's exit was a planned strategy, a genuine reaction, or both? I want to hear from you. The meeting had been 6 weeks in the making. Washington had requested it. The White House had publicly framed it as the opportunity to resolve the most damaging trade dispute in North American history. The stakes were not abstract. 417,000 American workers in automotive plants, energy facilities, agricultural operations, logistics networks had been told by their employers that this meeting was the last diplomatic bridge standing between their jobs and a wave of layoffs, factory closures, and economic contraction that follows when a $700 billion annual trade relationship collapses without a replacement in place. The meeting was held at the Fairmont Château Laurier in Ottawa, a neutral site selected by Canada, accepted by Washington only after the White House's first suggestion of holding it in Washington was declined. That single detail, the location, was already a signal about which side was setting the terms. The American delegation arrived with 14 senior officials: the U.S. Trade Representative, the Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs, and a full supporting team, a size that indicated Washington had prepared for a long, complex, multi-stage negotiation. Canada sent 8: Carney, the finance minister, the trade minister, and 5 senior advisors. Canada had not prepared for a long negotiation. Canada had prepared for exactly what happened. The American team presented its proposal after 15 minutes of formal courtesies. The document was 61 pages long, 4 weeks of preparation by the Trade Representative's Office in coordination with the White House, the Commerce Department, and the National Economic Council. Before the meeting, administration officials had privately briefed reporters that this document represented a complete framework for restoring the bilateral trade relationship to full strength. Now, here is where this gets extraordinary. And stay with me, because what was actually inside that proposal is the reason this video is being watched in over 40 countries right now. What the document contained was not a framework for restoration. It was a framework for Canadian submission, written in the language of partnership. It demanded Canada eliminate its retaliatory tariffs entirely within 30 days, while American tariffs on Canadian goods would be reduced gradually over 36 months, subject to American compliance reviews. Canada disarms immediately. America keeps its leverage for 3 years. It required that Canada's new trade diversification agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India be placed under a bilateral compatibility standard. Trade lawyers reviewing the language later that afternoon identified this plainly. It was a demand that Canada's new international partnerships be subject to American approval. It required the creation of a joint trade oversight body with an American-appointed chair and American veto power over Canadian trade policy decisions. In effect, it was asking Canada to hand Washington a seat at the head of its own economic table. It demanded that Canada standardize energy export pricing to pre-dispute market levels, a requirement that would have forced Canada to voluntarily accept below-market prices for its oil and gas at a moment when European and Asian buyers were paying significantly more than the United States ever had. It required the suspension of Canada's role in the commodity settlement framework, the parallel financial architecture Carney had designed specifically to reduce global dependence on dollar-based trade. And then came the clause that the Canadian delegation later described as the point the Prime Minister stopped reading. The proposal required Canada to issue a public statement formally recognizing the United States' legitimate economic interest in Canadian trade policy, and to reaffirm the bilateral relationship as the foundational basis of Canada's international economic engagement. This was not a negotiating document. It was a surrender document with a diplomatic cover page. It asked Canada to dismantle its new partnerships, freeze its financial innovations, accept below-market resource prices, and publicly declare its economy subordinate to American priorities, in exchange for the partial, conditional, delayed removal of tariffs that had already been demonstrated to harm the American economy more than the Canadian economy. Carney read for 9 minutes. The room was silent. At the 9-minute mark, he did not look up. He placed both hands flat on the table. He waited 2 seconds. He slid the folder to the center of the table, not to the side, to the center, as if returning something that did not belong to him. He stood. He fastened his jacket. He walked out. The finance minister and trade minister followed. The entire Canadian delegation was through the door in under 15 seconds. No words, no raised voices, no slammed doors, just the sound of chairs moving and footsteps, and then nothing. The silence was the statement. The pool camera inside the room captured what followed. The American delegation sat motionless for nearly a minute. The expression on the face of the U.S. trade representative, caught in high definition, replayed within hours on every major broadcast network on the planet, communicated more about the real balance of power between these two countries than any official statement could have. One career trade official who had served across 4 administrations, speaking to colleagues afterward, was quoted as saying, "Upon reviewing the proposal on the flight to Ottawa, I thought, if I were sitting across from this document, I would leave too. This is not a proposal. It is an insult formatted as a PDF." That 11-second clip of Carney rising, fastening his jacket, and walking out became the most watched diplomatic footage in internet history within 6 hours of the meeting ending. Not because of what was said, because of what was not said, because of what the silence communicated and what it revealed about a fundamental shift in the balance of power that Washington had apparently not yet registered. 45 minutes later, Carney stood at a podium at the Canadian Parliament building. He was calm, almost quiet. He spoke for 3 minutes, the shortest public address of his tenure as Prime Minister, and every sentence was chosen with the precision of a man who understood that brevity, in this moment, carried more weight than length. He said, "This morning, the United States presented Canada with a document it described as a proposal. I have reviewed many proposals, as a central banker, as a financial regulator, as a head of government. A proposal implies 2 parties. A proposal implies exchange. A proposal implies that both sides have something to offer and something to receive. What was delivered this morning was not a proposal. It was a demand for submission, unconditional, comprehensive, and offered in return for nothing except the partial reversal of measures that have damaged the American economy more than the Canadian economy." He continued, "Canada has spent 18 months building an economy that does not depend on American trade favor. We have new partners, new markets, new financial systems, new energy export corridors, a diversified, resilient, internationally connected economy that did not exist 2 years ago, and that exists now specifically because the United States made dependence on American partnership too risky to sustain. We built alternatives. The alternatives work. And we did not build them to abandon them the moment Washington decided it was ready to talk." Then he looked directly into the camera. 8 words, delivered without drama, without anger, without performance, with the quiet finality of a decision that has already been made and cannot be unmade. He said, "We didn't walk out. We moved on." Within 9 minutes, those 8 words were trending globally. Within an hour, they were the headline on every major financial and political publication in the world. The Financial Times, 8 words that ended an era. The Economist, the departure that proved Canada had already departed. Now let's be precise about what those 8 words actually mean for real people, because this is where the story stops being about diplomacy and starts being about kitchen tables and mortgage payments, and whether a factory in Michigan is still operating in 6 months. Pause on that comment now. I want to know, do you think Washington genuinely miscalculated Canada's position, or do you think this was intentional? Tell me below. The 417,000 American workers directly tied to bilateral Canadian trade are not a policy abstraction. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, cross-referenced with Commerce Department trade flow data and Federal Reserve regional employment analysis, identifies them precisely. 112,000 in automotive manufacturing connected to cross-border supply chains. 87,000 in energy and petrochemical sectors dependent on Canadian crude and natural gas. 63,000 in agriculture and food processing reliant on Canadian inputs, wheat, canola, potash, livestock, 41,000 in logistics and transportation. The remaining 114,000 spread across manufacturing, technology, construction, and services whose operations depend in whole or in part on the continuity of a trade relationship that now has no diplomatic channel open to repair it. These workers had been told by their employers for weeks that this meeting was the last mechanism available to prevent what came next. That a negotiated resolution was the only barrier between their current employment and the job losses, factory closures, and regional economic contraction that follows when a $700 billion annual trade relationship fractures without replacement. The meeting was supposed to be the beginning of recovery. Carney's departure ended it before it started. And the undeniable, documented reason is that the United States arrived not with a genuine offer, but with a demand for capitulation, and in doing so revealed that Washington still had not absorbed the fundamental reality that 18 months of Canadian economic diversification had created. The response from American elected officials was immediate and unambiguous in its target. The governor of Michigan held a press conference within 3 hours. His frustration was precise. 417,000 American workers woke up this morning believing their government had sent a serious offer to Ottawa. Their government sent a 61-page document asking Canada to surrender everything it has built over 18 months in exchange for nothing but the possibility of tariff relief in 3 years. Of course, Carney left. Anyone would leave. My workers are going to pay the price for the arrogance of people in Washington who still believe they can demand their way to a result when they no longer hold the advantages they once held. The governor of Ohio followed. I have 41,000 workers in this state whose employment depends on Canadian trade. The White House had one opportunity to begin repairing this relationship. One meeting. And they sent a proposal so one-sided that the other party left the table in 9 minutes. My workers' livelihoods deserved better than 9 minutes. They deserved a government that understood the difference between negotiating and demanding. Republican senators from affected states, several of whom had already broken with the White House on the Canada Trade Normalization Act, responded with language sharper than anything they had previously directed at the administration. Senator Erickson of Iowa. I spent 6 months telling my farmers that a negotiated settlement was coming. I told them to hold on. I told them this meeting would create a path forward. And now I find out that the proposal we sent was so one-sided that the Canadian Prime Minister read it for 9 minutes and left. My farmers do not care about sovereignty clauses and oversight bodies. They care about selling their crops. And this administration just closed the only diplomatic door left open to help them. Warren Buffett addressed the negotiation dynamics of the departure with the authority of someone who had spent 7 decades on both sides of negotiating tables, and who recognized in Carney's 11-second exit the single most decisive move available in any negotiation: the willingness to leave. He did not discuss trade policy. He did not discuss tariffs or sovereignty or diplomatic protocol. He discussed leverage, what it is, where it originates, and why the capacity to leave is not one form of leverage among many, but the foundational source from which all other leverage derives. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I have negotiated thousands of transactions, acquisitions, partnerships, supply contracts, licensing agreements, every kind of arrangement that requires 2 sides to reach terms. And across all of those negotiations, across all of those decades, I have learned one truth that supersedes every tactic, every strategy, every method in every negotiation textbook ever written. The side that can leave wins. Not the side with more money, not the side with more market share, not the side with more political power or military power or anything else. The side that can leave, because leaving is the only move that cannot be countered. You can respond to a demand with a counter-demand. You can respond to a threat with a counter-threat. You can respond to an argument with a counter-argument. You cannot respond to someone walking out the door. When they leave, the conversation is over. The only question that remains is who needed the deal more. Carney left because he could leave. That is the entire analysis. Everything else, the sovereignty clauses, the offensive terms, the demand for submission, is context. The core fact is simpler and more powerful than all of it. Canada spent 18 months building the capacity to leave. And the moment that capacity was tested, it worked exactly as designed. The United States arrived at that table believing it was offering Canada a rescue. Canada arrived, opened the folder, and found it was being asked to return everything it had built. And Canada said no. Not with words, not with a statement, not with a counterproposal, but with the sound of a chair, the click of a door, and a country that had already built its future somewhere else, walking calmly toward it. That is what leverage looks like when it is real. Not when it is claimed, not when it is threatened, when it is exercised, quietly, completely, and without the need to explain itself. If this story shifted how you see this moment, share it with one person today. The 417,000 workers caught in the middle of this deserve more people understanding exactly what happened and exactly why. Drop your take in the comments. Was this the right move by Canada? Or did Carney close a door that needed to stay open? We cover stories like this every day, so if you want the analysis before anyone else does, subscribe. It takes 3 seconds, and it's the most important button on this page.